On February 12, 1987, 26-year-old David Malcom was found dead inside the American Red Cross Emergency Shelter at 717 West Court Street in Ithaca, New York. Malcom was an employee of the shelter and had been working a 24-hour shift at the facility at the time of his death. Law enforcement was called to the scene after a staff member discovered his body. Investigators determined that Malcom was the victim of a homicide. Police officials from the Ithaca Police Department responded to the shelter that day and began what would become a long-running homicide investigation. The initial inquiry focused on determining when Malcom had died and identifying any witnesses or suspects who might have been in or around the shelter during the hours preceding the discovery of his body. At the time, investigators found evidence indicating that Malcom had suffered multiple wounds consistent with deliberate violence, though detailed information about the specific nature of those wounds was not publicly disclosed in early reports. The homicide was officially recorded as having occurred on February 11, 1987. In the immediate aftermath, detectives interviewed staff, visitors, and community members who might have had contact with Malcom or who had been near the shelter in the days immediately preceding his death. Investigators also examined the shelter itself for physical evidence. Because crime scene processing technology in 1987 was limited compared to later decades, there were constraints on what forensic evidence could be developed at the time. Despite early investigative efforts, no suspect was arrested and no definitive motive was established in the 1980s. By the end of 1988, the case had gone cold, with no charges filed. For many years, Malcom's loved ones and members of the Ithaca community were left without answers as to who killed him and why. His family, including his sister, engaged in public appeals for information, emphasizing that the case remained unresolved and urging anyone with knowledge to come forward. Over time, incremental investigative reviews occurred, but substantial progress was limited. Law enforcement periodically re-examined aspects of the case, but the investigation did not produce new leads that led to prosecution for many years. In the mid-2010s, the Ithaca Police Department renewed its commitment to solving the case. Around 2015, Deputy Chief Vincent Monticello, who had been a young officer in Ithaca when Malcom was murdered, reopened the investigation with the intention of reviewing the original evidence and pursuing new leads using more modern investigative resources. Monticello and his team collaborated with the New York State Police Troop C Major Crimes Unit, the New York State Police Forensic Identification Unit, and the Tompkins County District Attorney's Office to reassess the cold case from the ground up. Investigators also reached out to other law enforcement partners and re-interviewed witnesses who were previously interviewed in 1987 and at other points in the investigation's history. Over the years, new forensic techniques, including improvements in DNA analysis and the application of advanced laboratory testing by state police forensic units, allowed investigators to revisit physical evidence collected at the shelter more effectively than had been possible in the late 1980s. Anonymous tips and leads received between 2019 and 2023 played a role in refocusing investigators on specific lines of inquiry that had previously been unexplored or underdeveloped. This resurgence of interest, combined with advances in forensic science, contributed to breakthroughs in the case. By the early 2020s, law enforcement officials publicly stated that they believed they had developed a viable suspect and that the investigation was approaching a resolution. Although the name of the suspect was not released in some official statements, in part because the individual was deceased and could not be prosecuted, police confirmed that they had determined who was responsible for Malcom's murder. The suspect was identified as the estranged boyfriend of a teenage girl who had sought refuge at the Red Cross shelter on February 11, 1987. According to investigators, the girl had arrived at the shelter earlier that afternoon seeking assistance after a domestic dispute with her boyfriend. Malcom had been assisting people at the shelter when she arrived. Investigators concluded that the suspect came to the shelter later that day and demanded to know the girl's location. Malcom, acting in what police described as a protective manner, refused to disclose her whereabouts. It was during this encounter that Malcom was killed. Investigators characterized his actions as an effort to help the girl and keep her safe from harm. The suspect, confronted with Malcom's refusal to cooperate, allegedly attacked him, resulting in the fatal injuries Malcom suffered. The police believe the homicide occurred as a direct result of this confrontation. The suspect, believed to be responsible for the killing, was linked to the crime through a combination of DNA evidence, investigative leads developed over years of work, and witness or contextual information gleaned during the renewed investigation. Law enforcement officials confirmed that this individual had died in 2019. Because he was deceased, no criminal prosecution could be pursued. However, authorities stated that they were confident in the findings based on the totality of evidence developed by the multi-agency investigative team over several years. The suspect's identity was withheld from public release by the Ithaca Police Department in official announcements. The Ithaca Police Department held a meeting with Malcom's family members, including his sister, to disclose the investigative conclusions. Investigators expressed regret for the long delay in resolving the case and apologized for the decades it took to arrive at a conclusion. Law enforcement officials described the modern forensic tools and sustained interagency collaboration as crucial components in solving the crime. The Tompkins County District Attorney and representatives from the New York State Police also participated in meetings with the family.
Officials emphasized that the case resolution offered clarity about what happened on the day Malcom was killed, even though justice in the form of prosecution was not possible due to the suspect's death. The resolution of the David Malcom homicide represents a number of investigative trends observed in long cold cases, a renewed dedication to reviewing unresolved homicides, the application of modern forensic science that was unavailable at the time of the original investigation, and the willingness of law enforcement to pursue leads received even many years after a crime occurred. It also reflects the complexity of violent crime investigations when initial evidence is limited or when key witnesses and suspects are not identified early. Over time, persistent investigative effort and advances in technology can yield results that eluded earlier investigators. David Malcom was known by family and friends as a committed community worker and a compassionate individual who dedicated himself to helping others. As an employee of the Red Cross shelter, he assisted vulnerable people seeking support and refuge, and his murder left a lasting impact on those who knew him. The investigation's conclusion, that he was killed because he refused to betray the trust of a person seeking help, reframed the narrative around his death, highlighting his protective actions in the hours before he died. Despite the suspect's death preventing a criminal prosecution, authorities indicated that the case file remains part of the historical record, and the investigative conclusions were based on the best available evidence developed by the multi-agency investigative team over several years. The findings closed a chapter for the Malcom family that had remained open for nearly 4 decades, providing a factual explanation for a homicide that had remained unresolved since 1987. Law enforcement officials continue to encourage anyone with additional information about the case or related matters to contact the Ithaca Police Department, with the understanding that corroborating detail can further confirm and contextualize established findings. The investigation into David Malcom's murder involved contributions from multiple agencies at the local, county, and state level, illustrating how long-term collaborative efforts can ultimately determine what happened in a case that initially defied resolution. Although criminal charges were never filed, the investigative conclusion is accepted as the most complete and evidence-supported explanation available for Malcom's death.
Donna Sue Hyatt was a 38-year-old resident of Carlsbad, New Mexico, when she was found dead in her home in July 1987. On July 8th of that year, law enforcement responded to a distress call from a residence on Elm Street in Carlsbad after relatives discovered Hyatt's body inside her living room. Officers from the Carlsbad Police Department were the first to arrive. Once inside, investigators determined that Hyatt had been the victim of a violent crime, and homicide detectives were called to the scene. At the time of the initial investigation, officers noted that Hyatt had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Investigators documented evidence at the scene and collected physical items that could be relevant to determining what had happened. Witnesses told police they had seen Hyatt earlier that evening in the company of a tall, Caucasian male walking away from a nearby store. Despite this information and other early leads, detectives were unable to identify a suspect, and the case quickly stalled. Over the ensuing months and years, Carlsbad investigators pursued leads and interviewed possible witnesses, but without a firm identification of a perpetrator, the homicide remained unsolved. As the investigation lingered without resolution, the case effectively became a cold case. Hyatt's family and the Carlsbad community were left without answers about who had taken her life or why. In the years that followed, other developments in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, allowed many cold cases to be revisited, but Hyatt's case remained unresolved for decades. In some later reviews, evidence collected at the crime scene was retested using contemporary methods in the 2010s, but these tests did not immediately produce a match in national criminal databases. The case continued to be classified as a cold homicide investigation. In the early 2020s, nearly 4 decades after Hyatt's death, detectives from the Carlsbad Police Department renewed their focus on the case. Detectives Tilly Landgraf and Tim Nice began a systematic review of the evidence and pursued investigative avenues that were not available in the 1980s. Advances in genetic analysis and forensic science, including the development of forensic genetic genealogy, had enabled law enforcement to create investigative leads from DNA profiles that previously could not be matched to known individuals. As part of the renewed investigation, crime scene evidence from Hyatt's murder was submitted to a private forensic laboratory that specialized in forensic-grade genome sequencing. This laboratory used advanced DNA sequencing technology to build a comprehensive genetic profile from material recovered at the scene. Once the profile was assembled, skilled genealogists used it to identify potential family connections and trace investigative leads. These leads pointed toward a possible suspect who had not previously been conclusively linked to the crime. Detectives investigating the case identified Michael Ruff Wigley as a person of interest. Law enforcement records show that Wigley had a history of sexual assault offenses in the early 1980s and had been investigated previously for violent crimes. After serving time in prison for one of those assaults, Wigley was released before 1987. Investigators also obtained information indicating that Wigley was living in or near Carlsbad around the time of Hyatt's murder, consistent with witness accounts placing a tall, Caucasian male with her earlier on the day of the homicide. Because Wigley had died in an automobile accident in 1989, he could not be arrested or prosecuted at that time.
However, cold case detectives sought to obtain a DNA sample from Wigley for comparison with the profile generated from the crime scene. Investigators secured a court-authorized search warrant to exhume Wigley's remains from his burial site in Texas. The exhumation was carried out in cooperation with authorities in Amarillo, Texas, where Wigley had been buried. The purpose of the exhumation was to retrieve DNA that could be tested and compared to the evidentiary profile developed from Hyatt's case. Once Wigley's remains were exhumed and an appropriate DNA sample was obtained, the laboratory conducted genetic testing. The results were definitive. The DNA from Wigley's remains matched the DNA profile generated from material collected at Hyatt's crime scene. The match positively and conclusively identified Michael Ruff Wigley as the person whose genetic material was present in the evidence associated with Hyatt's murder. Investigators also confirmed, based on interviews with witnesses and information gathered from family members and historical records, that Wigley had been present in Carlsbad and in surrounding areas at the time of the homicide. The identification of Wigley as the suspect in Hyatt's murder brought closure to a homicide investigation that had remained unresolved for 36 years. Officials from the Carlsbad Police Department and the city of Carlsbad credited the persistence and diligence of cold case detectives with the breakthrough. They also acknowledged the contribution of earlier investigators whose careful preservation of evidence in 1987 made modern testing possible. The mayor of Carlsbad publicly recognized the work of detectives and thanked them, along with the community, for supporting the renewed investigation efforts. Although Wigley's death in 1989 prevented any criminal charges or trial in connection with Hyatt's death, law enforcement officials stated that the DNA evidence and investigative findings supported the conclusion that he was responsible for the homicide. Investigators emphasized that the resolution of the case provided factual clarity about what had happened and offered a measure of closure to Hyatt's surviving family and the Carlsbad community. They further noted that the case illustrates how advances in forensic science, particularly DNA and genetic genealogy, can help solve cases that were once thought unsolvable. In describing the impact of the resolution, local officials said that the case underscores the importance of evidence preservation and interagency cooperation. Without the retention of physical evidence from the original crime scene and the willingness of the Carlsbad Police Department to pursue new technologies, the investigation might never have reached this conclusion. In this case, decades of careful investigative work and scientific progress ultimately led to a definitive identification of the person linked to the violent crime. Donna Sue Hyatt was described by family and friends as a loving daughter, sister, mother, and grandmother. At the time of her death, she was known in her community and was remembered as someone who cared about her family and those around her. The unresolved nature of her murder had weighed on her loved ones for many years, and the identification of a suspect brought a mixture of emotions, including relief that the forensic truth had been established. Hyatt's case also attracted attention in true crime media and podcasts, where it was discussed as an example of how forensic genealogy can solve cold cases long after they have gone dormant. Prior retesting in the 2010s had revived interest in the case, but it was the later application of genetic genealogy that ultimately brought about the identification. The sequence of scientific advances reflects broader trends in criminal investigations, where historical evidence can be revisited and reinterpreted through the lens of new methodologies. While no criminal prosecution occurred due to the suspect's death, authorities expressed that the resolution of the case was still significant. The public announcement of the identification was intended to honor the memory of Donna Sue Hyatt and acknowledge the thorough work of investigators who persisted over decades. Law enforcement has reiterated that even when suspects cannot be prosecuted, identifying the person responsible for a violent crime contributes to historical record, public safety, and the emotional closure of victims' families. The case of Donna Sue Hyatt, once unsolved for more than 3 decades, is now definitively linked to a suspect through modern forensic science. The investigative breakthrough on April 11, 2023, marked the conclusion of one of Carlsbad's longest-running cold case homicides, illustrating how technological and methodological advances can reshape the outcomes of long-stalled investigations.